I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. The sun dipped low over the horizon as Molly set the table, her movements deliberate, almost robotic. Dinner had always been our sacred time, a pause in the chaos where we could reconnect. But lately, the air between us had shifted. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now felt forced, like we were actors rehearsing an old script. Tonight, though, I could sense something different. Molly's hands trembled slightly as she laid out the wine glasses. Her eyes, usually bright with humor, darted nervously to the floor. "Billy," she started as we settled into our seats, her voice tight and clipped. "I need to talk to you about something important." I set down my fork, giving her my full attention. "All right. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her napkin. "This isn't easy to say, but I've been feeling confined lately. Like I need to explore something I've never had the chance to." "Confined?" I repeated, my voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Molly, we've always talked about things. If something's bothering you, just say it." She exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her words had already worn her down. "Billy, it's about Nick." Nick. I should have seen this coming. His name had been a fixture in Molly's recent stories, her new co-worker, the guy who made her laugh during stressful meetings. I'd thought nothing of it at first. But now, hearing his name spoken with such gravity, the pieces began to fall into place. "What about Nick?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. Molly met my gaze, her blue eyes glistening. "We've grown close over the past few months. Too close. And I need to figure out what that means." Silence hung heavy between us, punctuated only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I searched her face for some hint of doubt, some sign that she didn't believe the words she was saying. But her expression was resolute. "You're saying you want to cheat on me," I said finally, the words cutting through the stillness like a blade. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It's not cheating if I'm honest with you. This is about clarity, Billy. I need to know if this feeling is real or if it's just curiosity." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Clarity. That's a good one, Molly. And you think I'm supposed to just sit here and nod while you explore with your coworker?" Her lips tightened. "It's one weekend. Just one. And then it's over. We can move past this and be stronger for it." I stared at her, a cocktail of anger and disbelief bubbling in my chest. "You've planned this, haven't you? This isn't some sudden revelation. You've been rehearsing this speech, trying to justify whatever it is you're about to do." "Billy, please." "No, Molly," I snapped, pushing my chair back. "You don't get to dress this up as something noble. It's betrayal, plain and simple." Her face crumpled, but I couldn't bring myself to care. For the first time in our marriage, the trust we built felt like a fragile facade, something easily shattered. But instead of storming out or raising my voice, I took a deep breath and made a decision. "Fine," I said, my voice icy. "Do what you have to do. But don't expect me to stick around and pick up the pieces when it all falls apart." Her eyes widened in surprise, as if she'd expected me to argue, to plead. Instead, I stood and walked away, leaving her to sit alone with her guilt. The next day, I watched her pack for her weekend retreat with a quiet detachment. She avoided my eyes as she zipped up her overnight bag, her movements quick and precise. I wondered if she'd packed anything special for Nick, lingerie, perfume, something to make the betrayal even more poignant. "I'll be back Sunday evening," she said as she slung the bag over her shoulder. "We'll talk then." I nodded, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a response. As the door clicked shut behind her, I sank onto the couch and stared at the blank TV screen. Anger simmered beneath the surface, but I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I focused on what needed to be done. If Molly thought she could waltz back into our marriage after this, she was sorely mistaken. I wasn't a man who would be cuckolded and then thanked for my understanding. No, I had other plans, plans that would ensure she felt the full weight of her decisions. That evening, I logged onto her computer, my hands trembling slightly as I navigated to her emails. She'd always been careless with her passwords, and it took only a few tries before I was in. The inbox was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, messages from Nick that ranged from flirtatious to explicit, hotel reservations for the weekend, even a shared Google Calendar event titled Weekend Retreat. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and heartbreak as I pieced together their affair. It wasn't just about the physical act, it was the planning, the secrecy, the willingness to lie and deceive. Molly, the woman I'd vowed to love and cherish, had become a stranger. By the time I shut the laptop, my course of action was clear. I printed out every damning email, every receipt, every scrap of evidence I could find. Then I drafted divorce papers, making sure the terms left no room for negotiation. If Molly wanted clarity, I would give her a reality check instead. The house was eerily quiet that weekend. I busied myself with small tasks, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep my mind from wandering. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts always drifted back to Molly and Nick. Were they laughing together? Sharing secrets? Making love in a hotel bed? By Sunday evening, I was ready. The folder of evidence sat on the coffee table, a silent testament to her betrayal. When Molly walked through the door, her face was a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Billy, she began, but I cut her off with a gesture toward the folder. "Don't," I said coldly. "Just read." Her hands shook as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. With each new document, her face grew paler. By the time she reached the divorce papers, tears streamed down her cheeks. "Billy, please," she sobbed. "I made a mistake, but I can fix this. We can fix this." I shook my head, my expression unyielding. "You don't fix a marriage by breaking it, Molly. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." She pleaded with me, her words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. But I didn't falter. The woman standing before me was no longer the Molly I had loved, and I couldn't forgive the stranger she had become. The house felt unnaturally still after Molly left. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the folder of evidence I'd painstakingly compiled. The anger that had fueled me earlier was now a slow, simmering burn. There was no satisfaction in exposing her betrayal, no joy in holding the proof of her infidelity. Only emptiness. I didn't sleep that night. Each time I closed my eyes, my mind conjured images of Molly with Nick, their whispered conversations and secret glances. I imagined them laughing, tangled in hotel sheets, while I sat alone in a house built on broken promises. But amidst the ache of betrayal, something else began to stir, a grim determination to reclaim what little control I had left. By dawn, I had a plan. Sunday evening arrived with a quiet finality. I prepared dinner for one, the sounds of the kitchen almost comforting in their normalcy. A glass of wine sat untouched on the counter as I stared out the window, watching the world go on as if nothing had changed. When the front door finally opened, I turned to face her. Molly stepped inside, her face shadowed by hesitation. Her usual confidence had been replaced by a cautious, almost timid demeanor. The overnight bag dangled loosely from her shoulder, as if she hadn't decided whether to drop it or cling to it for support. "Billy," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." "We do," I agreed, gesturing toward the couch. The folder sat on the coffee table between us, an unspoken barrier. Molly's eyes darted to it, her expression tightening as she sat down. "What's that?" she asked, her voice laced with unease. "Read it," I said simply. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder. The first page, a printout of an email exchange with Nick, hit her like a slap. Her lips moved silently as she scanned the words, her face growing paler with each line. By the time she reached the receipts for the hotel and the draft divorce papers, tears streamed down her cheeks. "Billy, I can explain," she choked out, closing the folder and clutching it to her chest as though she could shield herself from its contents. "Don't," I said coldly. "You had your chance to explain when you decided to betray me. Now, I'm done listening." She shook her head, her tears falling faster. "It wasn't what you think. It wasn't about love or leaving you. I just needed to know. You needed to know if screwing your coworker would fix your boredom." I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You didn't just hurt me, Molly. You destroyed everything we built. For what? A thrill?" Molly buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled but no less wrenching. "It was a mistake," she pleaded. I thought it would make me appreciate what we have even more." Her words hung in the air, absurd and hollow. I wanted to yell, to throw the folder at her, to scream until my voice gave out. But instead, I took a deep breath and leaned back in my chair. "You thought this would make you appreciate me?" I said, shaking my head. "You don't appreciate someone by stabbing them in the back. You killed us, Molly." She reached for me, her fingers brushing against my arm. "No, Billy, please. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I pulled away, standing up to put distance between us. "You think there's a magic solution? That you can snap your fingers and make this go away?" "No, Molly. There's no going back." For a moment, she just sat there, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Then, like a drowning woman grasping for a lifeline, she straightened and squared her jaw. "I'll give up Nick," she said, her voice cracking. "I'll quit my job if I have to. I'll go to counseling. Anything. Just tell me what to do." Her desperation should have moved me, but it didn't. It felt hollow, like the practiced apologies of a child caught red-handed. I knew better than to let her words sway me. "It's not about what you can do now," I said. "It's about what you've already done. Trust is gone, Molly. And without trust, there's nothing left." The days that followed were a blur. Molly stayed in the house, her presence a constant reminder of the betrayal I couldn't escape. Each time I saw her, I felt a pang of anger mixed with an inexplicable sadness. I'd loved her once, deeply, fiercely, but that love had been tainted, and I couldn't see a way to revive it. She tried everything to win me back. Apologies, tears, even grand gestures like cooking my favorite meals or leaving me notes begging for a second chance. But each attempt only deepened the chasm between us. I couldn't look at her without seeing the lies, the secrecy, the broken promises. One evening, as I sat in the living room going over the divorce paperwork, she appeared in the doorway. Her face was drawn, her eyes puffy from crying. "Billy," she said softly, "can we talk?" I sighed, setting the papers aside. "What is it, Molly?" She stepped inside, her hands wringing nervously. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. And I realized something." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I've been selfish," she admitted. "I took you for granted. I thought I could have it all without considering the cost. And now I see what I've done." Her words, though heartfelt, felt like too little, too late. I wanted to believe her, to think she had truly learned from her mistakes. But the damage had been done, and no amount of remorse could erase it. "Molly," I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion, "it's not that simple. You can't undo what's already been done." "I know," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "But I don't want to lose you, Billy. Please. Give me one more chance." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a brief moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I can't, I said finally, my voice breaking. I can't go back. Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't reach for her. I couldn't. The distance between us was no longer physical, it was a chasm neither of us could cross. That night, as Molly cried herself to sleep in the guest room, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, now felt like a prison. I knew it was time to let go, to start over. But as much as I wanted to move forward, a part of me still clung to the life we had shared. In the quiet darkness, I made a promise to myself, I would rebuild. Not for Molly, not for anyone else, but for me. It was time to take back my life and find a future untainted by betrayal. The days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house became unbearable. Molly hadn't left, though her presence was a ghost of what it had been. She spent most of her time in the guest room, emerging only to make half-hearted attempts to reconcile. But her efforts, while persistent, rang hollow. It was as though she believed that if she begged long enough, cried hard enough, she could rewind the clock to a time before everything had shattered. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects. Anything to avoid going home to the wreckage of our marriage. My co-workers, oblivious to my personal turmoil, praised my productivity, calling me a machine. If only they knew. One evening, as I sat at my desk long after everyone else had gone, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Molly. "Dinner's ready if you're coming home tonight." I stared at the screen, torn between anger and pity. Her attempts to act like nothing had happened only deepened the wedge between us. Still, the thought of facing an empty house was worse than enduring her company. I grabbed my things and headed home. The smell of roasted chicken greeted me as I walked through the door. Molly stood in the kitchen, her back to me, arranging plates on the counter. For a moment, I hesitated, the scene so achingly familiar that it almost felt normal. But the reality of her betrayal quickly resurfaced, and I steeled myself. "You didn't have to cook," I said, setting my bag down. She turned, offering a tentative smile. "I wanted to. It's your favorite." I nodded but didn't respond. We ate in near silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound. Molly occasionally glanced at me, her eyes pleading, but I kept my focus on the plate. As we finished, she reached across the table, her hand hovering over mine. "Billy," she began softly, "I've been thinking, maybe we could go away for a weekend. Just the two of us. Start fresh." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "A weekend," I repeated, my voice laced with bitterness. "Like the one you just had with Nick?" She flinched, withdrawing her hand as though burned. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Fair?" I snapped, pushing my chair back. "You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when you decided to betray me? Was it fair when you lied to my face and slept with someone else?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't stop. The dam of resentment I'd been holding back finally burst. "You don't get to rewrite this story, Molly. You don't get to pretend that we can fix what you broke. Some things can't be undone." She sat frozen, her tears spilling over as she stared at me. For the first time, I saw true despair in her expression, not just guilt or regret but the crushing weight of knowing she had destroyed something irreplaceable. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this." "That's just it," I said, my tone softening slightly. "You can't." That night, I slept in the guest room while Molly took the couch. The house felt cavernous, its emptiness amplified by the silence. I stared at the ceiling, replaying our argument in my head. For all her faults, Molly wasn't entirely wrong. Part of me did want to escape, to find some way to forget the hurt and start over. But not with her. The next morning, I decided it was time to move forward. I reached out to a divorce lawyer, setting the wheels in motion for a clean break. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one that made sense. Molly's betrayal had severed the trust between us, and without trust, there was no foundation left to build on. Molly's reaction to the news was as expected: tears, pleading, and a string of empty promises. She swore she would do anything to make it right, but her words felt like ashes in my mouth. I had heard them all before, and they carried no weight. "I'll leave," she said one evening, her voice trembling. "If that's what you want. I'll give you space." "It's not about space, Molly," I replied. "It's about closure. We need to end this." Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. "I never wanted this," she whispered. I thought I was doing something for us." "You weren't," I said bluntly. "You were doing it for yourself. And now we're both paying the price." She nodded, her tears falling silently. For once, she didn't argue. The day Molly moved out was a quiet one. She packed her things while I stayed out of the house, not wanting to witness the final act of our marriage. When I returned that evening, the guest room was empty, the closet half bare. A note sat on the kitchen counter, her handwriting shaky and uneven. "Billy. I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't expect you to. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it away. I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I hope you find happiness again, even if it's not with me. Molly." I read the note twice before folding it and tucking it into a drawer. Her words, while heartfelt, did little to ease the ache in my chest. But they were a step, a small acknowledgement of the damage she had done. In the weeks that followed, I began to reclaim my life. I threw myself into work, spent time with friends I'd neglected, and took up hobbies I'd always wanted to try. The house, once filled with tension and sorrow, began to feel like home again. Molly's absence was palpable, but it was a relief more than a loss. Without her shadow hanging over me, I could breathe again. The wounds she had inflicted were still raw, but they were beginning to heal. And as I stood in the quiet of my living room one evening, staring out at the setting sun, I realized something: I was going to be okay. It would take time, but I would rebuild. Not for Molly, not for anyone else, but for myself. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to take on a sense of normalcy. The house, once a battlefield of tension and betrayal, had become my sanctuary again. I filled my time with work, friends, and the quiet solitude of my hobbies. I even started dating, a casual coffee here, a dinner there, though nothing serious. It felt too soon to let anyone in fully, and part of me wondered if I ever would. Molly's absence was a constant, bittersweet reminder of what we'd lost. Despite the pain she'd caused, I couldn't erase the memories of the good times we'd shared, the laughter, the adventures, the love that had once seemed so unshakable. But I told myself I was moving on, even if it still hurt. One evening, as I sat on the back porch nursing a glass of whiskey, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it but hesitated, curiosity getting the better of me. "Billy, it's Molly. I need to see you. Please." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. I hadn't heard from her since she moved out, and part of me had hoped I never would. But the message was unsettling, almost desperate. Against my better judgment, I replied. "What's this about?" Her response was immediate. "It's important. I promise I won't waste your time." Reluctantly, I agreed to meet her the next evening at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Molly was already seated when I arrived, her once bright blue eyes now shadowed and tired. She looked like a faded version of herself, the vibrant woman I had married replaced by someone worn and weary. I sat across from her, unsure of what to say. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice soft but strained. "Let's skip the small talk," I replied. "What do you want, Molly?" She flinched at my tone but nodded. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," she began. I know I don't deserve it. But there's something you need to know. I folded my arms, waiting. Her hands trembled as she pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag and slid it across the table. I went to the doctor a few weeks ago, she said, her voice breaking. I haven't been feeling well. I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the words. My stomach dropped as the meaning sank in. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Molly, I whispered, my throat tightening. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't want to tell you, she said. I didn't think I had the right to ask anything of you after what I did. But I didn't know who else to turn to. I sat back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to walk away, to tell her this wasn't my problem anymore. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman I had loved, couldn't ignore her pain. What do you need from me? I asked, my voice hollow. She hesitated, wiping her eyes. I don't have anyone else, Billy, she said. Nick, he's gone. My family's scattered, and I can't do this alone. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. So now you come to me, I said. After everything, you think I'm just going to swoop in and save the day? She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with a quiet resignation. I don't expect anything, she said softly. I didn't know who else to call. I didn't sleep that night. Her words played on a loop in my mind, each repetition stirring a mix of anger, pity, and something I couldn't quite name. By morning, I had made a decision. I called her. I'll help, I said, my voice flat. But this doesn't mean I forgive you. I understand, she replied, her relief palpable even through the phone. The months that followed were a strange blur of routine and regret. I took Molly to her appointments, sat with her during chemo sessions, and helped her manage the mountain of paperwork that came with her diagnosis. She moved back into the house, not as my wife, but as a shadow of the woman she had been. Our conversations were sparse, mostly focused on logistics and medical updates. But there were moments, late at night, when the walls between us would crumble. She would talk about the past, our happiest memories, the dreams we'd shared, and I would listen, unsure if she was seeking absolution or simply clinging to the remnants of her life. As her health declined, she grew quieter, her once vibrant personality fading into the background. Watching her slip away was both heartbreaking and strangely cathartic. In her vulnerability, I saw glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to mourn what we had lost. It was a gray morning when she passed. The house was silent except for the steady hum of the heater. I sat by her bed, holding her hand as she took her final breath. Her face, once etched with pain, was serene. I sat there for what felt like hours, the reality of her absence sinking in. The woman who had hurt me, who had betrayed me, was gone. And yet, so was the woman I had loved, the one who had made me laugh, who had been my partner in every sense of the word. The funeral was small, attended only by a handful of her friends and colleagues. I stood at the back, listening to the eulogies and wondering if they had ever truly known her. Afterward, I returned to the house, now emptier than ever. As I sat in the living room, surrounded by the echoes of our life together, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not just for Molly, but for everything we had lost, the love, the trust, the future that would never be. It wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was the one I had. And as the sun set on the quiet, empty house, I realized that sometimes, closure doesn't come in the form of answers or resolution. Sometimes, it's simply learning to live with the pieces.